Here's the situation. You're teaching, you have important material. This is vital for the students to grasp. How do you know whether they understand it or not? Sometimes we have students who are self-aware enough to know that they don't understand and are self-confident enough to ask questions. But for the rest, it's often a mystery to us. We assume that our superior teaching means no one could possibly not understand. Or we assume that we can accurately read the faces of our students and see if they get it or not. But generally, we have to admit that the first time we or the students really know if they understand is when we give the test. Then we know who got it and who didn't. But let's say some didn't get it. What do? You've finished the unit. You really can't take time to go back over the unit again. But you also don't want students to just go on and never understand what you just taught, especially if they need it for future learning. How can we deal with this problem? This is the first of several videos where we'll look at the role of formative assessment in addressing this issue. The goal is that we and our students will have better knowledge of what they are and are not understanding, so we can address misunderstandings more effectively. We'll think about what formative assessment means, how to do it, and how to use it for increased student learning. So, what is formative assessment? Well, it's contrasted with summative assessment. Look at those two words. Formative, thinking about forming or shaping something. Summative, focusing on summing something up. In a nutshell, summative assessment is usually what we do at the end of a section, unit, chapter, or course. It's what we use to give grades. Formative assessment, in contrast, is done during the section or unit. It may or may not be graded, but it is used to form or direct or shape further instruction. Now, let's look at some contrasts between formative and summative assessment. First, what are the purposes of formative and summative assessment? Well, for formative, it's to improve instruction and provide student feedback. We teachers need to know whether our instruction is effective, and if not, we need to do something different. And we want to make those changes right now, when they'll be most beneficial for the students. And we want to know, and want the students to know, where they stand and what they still need to work on. In contrast, summative assessment is used to measure student competency. We need to know how much the student knows or has mastered, and we need to measure if the student has learned what he should. That's where we say Johnny's at 75% competency and Sally is at 98% competency. We give a measure. Well, when do we typically administer or use these different assessments? Formative assessments is done on an ongoing basis throughout the unit or section. It could be something that you do daily or maybe even several times a day. It's done often enough that it becomes useful for constant feedback for you and for the students. Summative assessment is normally done at the end of a unit or course. This is the typical test, research paper, project, etc. It's done to wrap up a section of instruction and tell us how the students have learned now that the unit is through. So how do the students make use of these results? The students can use formative assessments to monitor their own understanding. You know that when you're teaching, sometimes students think they understand just by listening to you. They'll say, yeah, I've got it, when they really don't. Some type of formative assessment can show them what they understand and, more importantly, what they don't. It gives them feedback when they can still address the problems and not wait until the end of the unit just to discover then that they never really understood the material. Students use summative assessments to see how they're progressing against goals and benchmarks. They see, okay, I've mastered 90% of the material in this unit because I got an A-. Obviously, it shows them if they're passing or not, and shows them how they're measuring up overall. How do teachers use the results? Well, teachers use formative assessments to check for student understanding on a regular, ongoing basis. Don't wait until the end of the chapter to see who learned. It's often too late to fix it then. Instead, you can see immediately who learned and who didn't. Then you can adjust the instruction if needed. For example, if most of your students didn't understand about alliteration in poetry, then you can immediately do something to help them. Or if you see that one student doesn't understand, you can give that one student some individual help. So how do teachers use summative assessments? Well, this is just the traditional grades and ultimately promotion. You need a passing grade to be promoted to the next grade or course. This is the obvious and the traditional way that we use grades and summative assessments. Finally, another difference between formative and summative assessments is what I call granularity. That is, how much of a given skill or body of knowledge is being assessed at a time. In formative assessment, you can look at individual steps in a process or a body of knowledge, while summative assessment focuses on the learning as a whole. For example, let's say you give a unit test on multiplying two 3-digit numbers together, and the grade is on the final answer, the complete process. But what if one of your students is struggling with the concept of place value and doesn't understand how to line up the numbers of the partial products? That's a different problem than another student who struggles with multiplying the single-digit numbers accurately. They both are getting the wrong answer. They're both going to get the same grade on the test, but for entirely different reasons. If you're giving formative assessments regularly, you can see that one student needs help with the place value idea, and you can give him just that help, not having to go through the whole process. Whereas with the other student, you can help him just with his multiplication facts and not have to go through the whole process. Or take an example from sports, maybe tennis instruction. You don't just look at the final score of the match. That's like the summative assessment. If you're a coach, you don't tell your tennis player, well, I want you to go out. What you really need to concentrate on is beating the other guy. Just look at the score. Just be sure you're scoring better than him. Okay, that doesn't help him, but that's the summative assessment. Instead, a formative assessment is you're looking at things like arm motion, your body motion, your foot action, and so on. Those are things that you look at, very specific details. If you look at all those elements, if you assess and correct those, then your final assessment, the score on the tennis match, will be more successful. So it's the same way with the classroom. If you get the individual steps right, if you can address those issues, then the final assessment is successful. So I hope you can see here why formative assessment is important. We want the students to focus not just on the final grade, but on the learning that needs to take place along the way. And we need to be able to give help and further instruction when it's needed, addressing specific areas of need. This is not something that automatically happens. It's not something that teachers can usually think up on the spur of the moment. You need to plan for how you're going to include formative assessments throughout your instruction and how you're going to use those results for further instruction. So in future sessions, we're going to consider how to design and conduct formative assessments. We'll think about different ways you can do formative assessments and what you can do in response to formative assessments. We'll also talk about the relationship between formative assessments and grades. In the meantime, if you have questions or specific things you'd like to see addressed, please drop me an email. Thank you for watching, and I hope this has been helpful for you.